guys fine with it? I'll try to go now.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
In this speech, I'll be starting off top of case, and then I'll be going through two contentions. Yeah. My time is going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Okay, hello, I'm Alexander Doft, and I'll be affirming the motion that this House believes that homeschooling should be presumptively permitted rather than presumptively forbidden. So, two definitions. First is on presumptively permitted. We're going to define this as like allowed with some standards, maybe a test of like basic grade level standards, like something similar to public school, just like test to ensure that it's like going well. We're going to define presumptively forbidden as very limited cases, basically just sickness. Now going on to our first contention, which is that homeschooling is good for students. Two subpoints here. First is that the educational outcomes overall are just better. This is shown with empirics. On average, homeschooled students in the US score approximately 22.8 percentile points higher on standardized tests than their public school counterparts. In a further breakdown, 34% higher on math and 25% higher on reading. This just this sounds like homeschooling. Homeschooling does lead to better it just sounds like homeschooling clearly leads to better intellectual capacity. Second subpoint is on unique circumstances. So there are like two things that we think really are like unique circumstances of why homeschooling is really uniquely good. First is that homeschooling provides a unique way for disabled students to thrive in like a schooling environment. In school, kids with disabilities are more often than not forced to be with students who learn at a normal pace. What does this do to them? It obviously hinders their education because they're at a pace not meant for them. But it also creates an internal comparison between them and their counterparts that's not good for their mental health. At home, they have the time and the resources needed to strive. They're not being compared to like kids who don't have any disabilities and can work at a normal pace. So we think that's the first thing, which is like for students who are like disabled. The second unique circumstance is it provides an escape for students who are bullied. 40% of students in the US in like public high schools feel that they're bullied, and of that 40%, 33% of them wish that they were homeschooled. So what you see here is that there's a better working environment, more fit to people's needs. Yeah.
Is this in the US?
Yeah, this is in the US. So it's more fit to people's needs, but it also produces better outcomes. This just seems like a clear like win-win opportunity. Okay, second contention is that homeschooling is good for society. 5 subpoints. First is that it saves the government money. So estimates from the DOE say homeschooling saves the government $51 billion, and this was from 2021 to 2022, increasing the amount available for public school students. Without homeschooling, the funding per student decreases. So what does this mean? It means that like the money that would normally go to these like students who would be in a public school education but are instead being homeschooled, that money is instead going to other students who are like in the public school system, so they're getting more money for their education. Second subpoint is on the laboratory for education. Homeschooling allows groups to experiment with new teaching methods, like hybrid learning or Montessori. These can later be used broadly, improving education for all. They can be like expanded as time progresses. Third subpoint is on ideological diversity. A factor behind 50% of families' choices to homeschool is teaching like specific things that are really important to the family, like morals, religion, or culture. Having people with a variety of beliefs is good for public discourse and for democracy, as it helps us imagine other ways to be. And it just like, this just seems pretty intuitive that if people are being like taught various like cultural norms, they can spread those when they go to like later education, like college. Sorry, I have a little bit of stuff to get through. Fourth subpoint is on backlash. So fundamentally, the US is not Germany. Americans value freedom of thought and religion, which are seen as core values of the American democracy. This is a massive erosion of people's abilities to raise their children as they see fit. A very important part of like the American ethos is that the parents have the right to decide what their children do, at least when they're minors. So why does that right not extend to the ability to how they should be educated because they are getting educated, there are certain standards that these homeschool students need to be met. It's just really a matter of parents like abilities and of parents like abilities.
Wait, PFC stopping time?
Yeah.
Wait, so you're saying that like the US is right now presumptively homeschooling, and wait, is that the argument they're trying to make? Or okay.
Okay, my time will continue in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the impact here is that there's more distrust in the government from people already like somewhat alienated, and it's a bit radicalizing. Okay. Final subpoint is on competition. The existence of homeschooling as an option provides an alternative to public schools. It creates a pressure for public schools to do well and innovate, or else those students are going to leave the public schools and begin homeschooling if those parents have those capacities. Why is this true? Because obviously, as we've just shown you before, homeschooling does produce better results if parents have the capacity to have their children be homeschooled. They'd probably rather better results. Public schools recognize this and consequently spend more time making sure that their students work harder in school and get better results. They're competing with each other, and consequently it just produces better students overall. It produces better discourse and a higher level of education across the country. For all these reasons, I could not be prouder to affirm.
Are you guys okay if I sit over here? Alright.
You can sit or stand.
Alright, that's it. Sit, I'm kinda tired. I'm gonna just, for some off case, that's okay, right? Or off timer now. I'm gonna be going down some top of case, 2 decides and then the advantages as they were read. Is anybody not ready? My time begins in 3, 2, 1. Not all parents homeschool for good reason, and not all kids can speak up when they're being failed. We don't oppose homeschooling, but it should be treated as an exception and not the default, because children deserve oversight, children deserve quality education, and children deserve safety. First, let's look at a comparative between Germany and the United States. They say it's very different. It's actually not. Germany has both private schools and public schools, yet what do we see? Germany's rank is 7th in educational rank, while the United States is 23rd, lagging behind, despite the United States being much more industrialized. This signals to you that the prevalence of homeschooling in the United States is actually preventing these public schools from doing well in educational ranks and values. And it just goes to show and illustrate the effect that homeschooling can have on a national agenda. Next, let's move to the weighing mechanism, which was not defined by side government. We're gonna say it's probably whatever's best for net benefits in general. This is important for you as a judge because you're weighing these impacts on whatever provides the net benefit towards society. With that said, let's move into the disadvantage 1, which is that of indoctrination and abuse. I repeat, indoctrination and abuse. This thesis for this is that presumptively permitting homeschooling allows ideological indoctrination and physical and psychological abuse. The warrants for this are number 1, it's vulnerable to abuse. There's no daily check-ins with mandated reporters like teachers and counselors constantly do, meaning that abuse detection plummets. According to the German Ministry of Education, school attendance is the primary safeguard against educational neglect and family violence. Gut check this, judge. If you are a student who's being physically abused at home, you go to school, then your teachers and counselors can stand up for you and report anything that's happening. But with homeschooling, that same application doesn't apply. The second is abuse is systemic. The Coalition for Responsible Home Educations says that 40% of serious child abuse cases in homeschooling involve chronic physical abuse, and 31% involve isolation or starvation. For instance, Shaunik's read this book about Educated, which depicts how her father's extremist ideology and her mother's herbal healing kept her out of school till what does that say, 14? 17. She didn't even know what the Holocaust was until college. This is just pretty bad and is going to cross by their ideological point. The third point is indoctrination. Many curriculum, the Belka books, teach creationism, slavery as God's plan, and reject civics, math, and science. Unregulated homeschooling leads to more radicalism, from Christian patriarchy to anti-vax movements. The fourth is extremism breeds radicalization. Both the FBI and the DHS warn that ideological isolated youth are more likely to fall into extremist pipelines. A former DHS analyst revealed that white hat nationalists and like sovereign citizen groups explicitly target homeschooled communities. The fifth is that the state is unable to fix things later. Once isolated, it's too late. Kids don't know their rights. They aren't exposed to peers, to other people, and to like science and other important factors. The Child Welfare League cites that like developmental damage is irreversible at this time once they get past the homeschool stage, and this impacts a whole lifetime. The impacts of this are twofold. Number one, quality of life decreases. Physical and emotional abuse reduce lifespan by like 70 years due to like the mental 20 years due to like the mental health impacts of depression, unemployment, etc. The second is dehumanization. Children are like seen as like tools for ideological reproduction. The disadvantage number two is that of widening educational inequality. I repeat, widening educational inequality. The claim is that presumptively permitting homeschooling entrenches class-based educational inequality and stunts child social development, especially among already marginalized communities. The warrants for this, well, there's a lot. The first is access to the quality education is unequitable. The A point is that affluent families can attend tutors, curriculums, and do homeschooling well, while low-income families can't, leading to a substandard public institution. The second is homeschooling. Homeschooling like removes state oversight. Without like marketing review, there's no guarantee kids are meeting grade level standards. While they do take a test at the end of the year, they don't address how we're actually enforcing whether like kids who are taking the homeschool are actually passing these tests or learning the curriculum at all, or how they enforce this mechanism. We tell you that like the standards for learning at all, especially in under-resourced homes, completely go away. The second warrant here is that of like social development requires peer interaction. Schools teach kids how to navigate diversity, like manage conflicts and build empathy. This inherently goes away because isolated homeschooling often denies them these developmental stages. The fourth point is homeschooling can lock in privilege. Wealthy families use it to bypass public accountability, such as like tailored test presentations, college boosting, and other mechanisms, while poor families like fall behind in the college race because they're not able to adapt for this. The fifth is presumptive permission amplifies the scale of it. When homeschooling becomes like default and it becomes more allowed, more families enter the system, and that decreases the pressure to fix the already eroding public schools. When more affluent families decide to take homeschooling because it's now presumptively allowed, then there's going to be an erosion of the public school system, as now there's nobody left to advocate for it to get better. The sixth is that children suffer silently. Kids can't actually report poor learning or social isolation to anybody because they have no interaction with them, which makes it so that there's like no way for them to report any abuse or neglect that they face. The seventh point here is that affluent families have like a disproportionate capacity to homeschool. 34% of homeschooling households have annual income of over 100K, which is higher than the average like public school annual income. Sorry. Why is this important? It basically tells you that the people who are like actually homeschooling are more affluent, which gives us access to like all the links we stated above. And then the eighth point here is schools lose donors. If higher income families are actually homeschooling instead of being in the public school system, then these public schools miss out on valuable capital to be able to afford new textbooks and provide learning for students. The impacts are threefold. Number one, deepening educational inequality. Number two, long-term wealth gaps. And number three, the collapse of the public school legitimacy. Let's move into the affirmative case. The first thing to talk about is about how the outcomes are inherently better. This is just because the people who are homeschooling are much more wealthier, therefore they have access to resources that enable them to do better on these test scores. It's not actually a testament to the individualized learning. The second thing that they say here is that it's unique circumstances. They talk about disabled students. We would say that's probably addressed within our ground, because like if you have like this could be characterized like as an illness if you're not able to like perform in school, and you probably would be able to get an exemption. But also they talk about what hinders education. We probably say that like they're not considering life after school. So yes, while it is possible that like if you were in a situation where you're getting bullied, that's probably not great for you. However, what we say is if you're homeschooled, it only exacerbates the problem because it puts you in a bubble. So then when you get to life after school and you actually have to go out in the world and interact, you're still going to face these negative consequences. If anything, school is uniquely better because it's such a tailored environment. There's ways to address it young, right? There's teachers and administrative staff around you to help stop bullying from occurring and teach you the skills to like be resilient and help stand up for yourself. The second advantage they talk about is that it's good for society. They talk about how like this saves government money and talks about being saved. We tell you that if there were more families which were like wealthy put in the public school system, they would have a louder voice and be more vocal about increasing public funding for schools, and this probably solves the internal link to education, which is like actually providing these schools with the income. Therefore, we think that we probably just solve better on our side. Then they talk about lab education. I don't think this was like articulated very clearly. Cross-apply the response above. They talk about ideological diversity. Again, this is like not a good thing because families are like indoctrinating their kids with like bad ideals. The public education system puts people with good ideals, but like if you cross-apply like everything we tell you in our case about how like people are taught like really bad things at home and how it's actually not very good. They say like the United States isn't Germany. There's not very much justification given for this. Bible's probably the same. They talk about religion as a reason, but like there's Bibles in Germany. Like trust me, like they have religion there too. And the last thing to say is competition. It provides alternative school. Private schools already solve for this. They already provide competition. Therefore, both sides solve. For this reason, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Everybody's still ready?
Give me a second.
So, everyone ready? Great. You guys ready? Okay, great. I'll begin my speech now. I'm going to start on the top of case, couple overviews. First, on this idea of, on the weighing mechanism, yeah, net benefits is good. Sorry, we forgot to say that. Then on this top of case, we hear from the opposition about government having good education and how, like, basically there's public and private schools in Germany and everyone's thriving, and the U.S. is bad at education, and the reason for that is because of homeschooling. That's just not the reason. The U.S. doesn't fund education in the same way Germany does. We don't have the same social services or programs like paid maternity leave to support families. There's a lot of other reasons that education in the U.S. isn't very good. Don't buy that it's just because of homeschooling. I don't think that that's the reason that Germany is doing better on education. I think there's a lot more nuance there. Then, I also just want to give like an overall response, which is I think a lot of the opposition case fails to deal with the fact that private schools are the alternative for the people they talk about. What they tell you is that most people who are doing homeschooling, or some share, are these privileged people who have a lot of money and lots of resources to give their kids fabulous educations. So if you tell these people, you can't homeschool anymore, what are they going to do? Put their kids in this U.S. public school system, which is known to be not that great, or send their kids to the nice private schools that they can afford to send them to when they're used to spending tons of money to pay for these private tutors for their homeschooled kids. I think it's pretty obvious that these wealthy families are going to choose to send their kids to private schools because they are willing to invest in their kids' education. They want to ensure they get the best opportunities. It's widely known that like private schools are like better than public schools for educating your kids. That's why like, people are willing to spend money on them. Therefore, you need to believe that all these privileged kids like they talk about, homeschooled in the status quo, go to private schools, not into public schools. That's going to be really key in my responses. With that, let's go to the line by line on their first contention on indoctrination and abuse. First, what we hear is about like these daily check-ins and basically about how like they solve for kids getting abused who are homeschooled. First, I want to note that I think a lot of this ends up being outside the scope of this round. Why is that? Because I think that a lot of these situations they talk about where parents are like locking their kids in a basement and not giving them food or like physically abusing their kids like extremely violently, these parents are already not meeting the basic standards of like our presumptively allowed system. These parents don't send their kids to get tested every year to make sure they're meeting educational standards because they're not educating their kids. Their kids wouldn't meet these educational standards because the way these tests work is that if your kids don't meet the standards, your kids can't be homeschooled anymore. They, know they're not educating their kids. They're already not in the system. Right? They talk about the example of educated. It's not like they were registering with the government and the government was making sure they were being homeschooled well because they weren't being homeschooled well. If they did that, they would have gotten caught.
You know what?
Yeah, sure.
Isn't it possible that you can like pass this test but still face abuse and indoctrination?
Yeah, for sure. But what I'm saying is that these like extreme kind of cult situations where your kid's like being physically abused most of the time are already they're not like letting their kid go to these checks because also parents who are physically abusing their kids are going to be scared if they let their kid go take a government test with like teachers running this test, they're going to talk about the abuse. These like extreme like cult religious like situations are probably outside the scope of the debate insofar as neither side do they register with the government. But then second, I think it's true that like a lot of what they talk about how these they talk about how like homeschooling is unregulated and this leads to radicalism. They're going to be taught like not to believe in like the Holocaust. First of all, I would say that these tests solve because the tests make sure that you know things like what is the Holocaust, like what are the basic like tenets of evolution. They include like all of the basic grade level things. That's what Alex tells you. And the enforcement I thought was pretty obvious. Just to clarify, if you don't pass the homeschooling test, then it becomes not allowed. It's presumably allowed, but if you fail these tests, then your kids have to go to a regular school because you're not meeting homeschooling standards. This I think solves for most of what they're talking about, but I think we can turn this insofar as when you persecute people, they become more radical. Right? If you have a family who's like used to homeschooling their kids and they teach their kids like mostly things that are pretty acceptable, maybe they have like they're really, really religious and they teach their kids like God created Earth in 7 days and like they do really believe in that, and maybe that's not like super scientific, but that's their belief and they teach their kid that. Now if the government tells them you can't homeschool your kid, like you guys are evil, like we don't trust you to homeschool your kid, you have to send your kid to school, what's their ideology going to turn to? It's going to turn from just being religious to being believing that the government is actively against them. They're going to become way more anti-government. They're they're going to start to say, the government hates us, they hate our religion, we need to fight back. This is how radicalism happens. This is how extremism happens when you make people feel persecuted for their ideologies. This means that you actually get more radicalism. Because now, when their kids get home from school, they're going to say, everything you learn in this school is wrong. Like, they're going to become more and more anti this school, and it's going to end up being more radical. Therefore, I think that this pretty effectively solves. Also, I think we can just kind of mitigate this. Like, the amount of people abusing their kids who are homeschooled is really, really small in the scale of like the amount of homeschooled kids overall. Like the vast majority of American kids are not being physically abused. I just don't think this is a super big like scale impact. And again, I also think you can abuse your kid like after school. I don't think if you want to abuse your kid that their side actually effectively solves, because kids who are being abused are too scared to report their parents for abuse. They don't think anything's going to change. That's why most kids don't report abuse even if they do go to school. Then second, on widening and educational equality. First, we hear about tutors and resources, and basically that like kids who are privileged and homeschooled are like going to get all these good things, but like kids who are poor and homeschooled won't get them. Yes, but the alternative is that these kids are going to go to private school. Their side doesn't solve for educational inequality there. And second, on social development, we basically hear that homeschooling is bad for your social development and that like schools are the only way to gain socialization. First, I don't think this is true. Most people who homeschool send their kids to like homeschool groups where they get to meet other kids and like socialize, especially because 50% of homeschoolers are doing it for like religious or cultural reasons. It's super common to have like church groups where they have homeschooled kids get together. But second, I think that social development doesn't necessarily come from just getting bullied over and over in a middle school. Like, I don't necessarily think it's true that bullying and like going to school and just being forced to put up with that is like necessarily going to translate to social development. Then on the idea that locks in privilege, same thing, they're just going to go to private schools either way. On the idea that this is causing the erosion of public schools, it's not true that these kids are going to go to public school and their parents are going to start donating to public school. Instead, their parents will put them in a private school and donate to the private school. This doesn't solve them, and same thing with like schools losing donors. But then I want to turn this on the idea on like the issue of systemic racism. What we see is that most teachers are human, and teachers have like extreme implicit biases. That's why like the treatment of African American and other minority kids in public schools isn't very good from their teachers. Like most report facing racism from teachers, facing micro and macroaggressions every day. They're not going to face that if they're homeschooled. When they're homeschooled, they're actually able to gain opportunities because their parents actually are able to help them. We see that this is something that people recognize because the percentage of like Black children being homeschooled has risen like fourfold in the last few years due to recognitions of like the racial violence that kids face in schools and the discrimination they face. Parents are aware that there's systemic racism in schools, and homeschooling helps to solve because it takes kids out of this harmful environment and gives them better opportunities. With that, let's go to rebuilding the AF case. First, on our subpoint about educational outcomes overall, they basically say that these kids are going to have good outcomes regardless because they're privileged. This is probably true to some extent, but we do think that studies have shown that the outcomes are better compared to their local region, like compared to the average in the region. Even in affluent regions, homeschooling is better. This makes a lot of sense on a like logical level because your parents can tailor your like studying exactly to what you need instead of having to follow along with class. You're not wasting any time going over things you already know. Second, on like disabled, they try to say they solve for disabled kids. Disabled kids don't have like illnesses. They have like disabilities. That's very different. In Germany, disabled kids aren't allowed to be homeschooled. Kids with like ADHD can benefit from personalized learning. That's pretty obviously not like an illness that causes you to require homeschooling under their side. We help them. Then on the idea that the bubble from bullying isn't good, I think it's still easier as an adult who's been empowered by your family to learn how to like live in the world after high school versus being forced to get bullied in middle school. Then on this idea, on our second contention about how homeschooling is good for society, they try to say that more families in the public school solve funding. This isn't true because those families will go to private school. There's uniquely $51 billion more for students on our side. They say ideological diversity is bad. This isn't true. It's always good to have a birthplace of ideas. I also want to introduce one additional argument under why homeschooling is good for students, which is on enjoyment. We think homeschooling is more fun because you're actually able to learn what's interests you. You're able to follow your passions. You're able to go out and do experiments, go to museums with your family. You're able to guide your own learning. I think this is just more enjoyable for students. It makes them more engaged in the educational process because they're able to have this sense of self-fulfillment and self-motivation. I think that just means you learn to love education a lot more. These students are a lot more likely to continue to pursue education, to pursue becoming teachers, to pursue like higher education because of this. For all these reasons, so proud to propose. Thank you.
Privilege.
I wish you could sit down. I would sit down.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
All right. The order for the speech is going to be some top of case, the affirmative, and then the negative. Time begins on my first word. first, I just want you to note the cost argument that the side affirmative brings up. When they say $51 billion because the rich kids pull their kids out of these public schools, which saves more money for the kids in public schools, that also happens on our side of the house simply because they say they go to private schools. So either way, their cost argument is washing out because inevitably at the end of the day, these same rich kids are still moving out of these home schools and then going into the private schools. What marginal offense is left at the affirmative and at the end of this round? The only thing that they're left with is this flexibility slash like enjoyment at home slash like you don't get bullied as much. And I'm gonna explain in this speech why that actually loses them the round. But first on the contention one about affirmative good for students. First, they bring up this argument that it's better for standardized testing and that homeschoolers do better on like standardized testing. Not only there are contradictory studies proving that many homeschoolers do worse in studies, like we're just reading blanket statistics on like he said, she said. We also give you the warrantation as to why. There's three reasons why homeschoolers usually do worse than like kids in school. The first here is there's less qualified teachers. We see that the parents usually don't have a master's degree in teaching and thus aren't as good as like, for example, teachers who get degrees from professional colleges. The second response here is not a structured curriculum. Even though homeschooling has to follow an agenda, parents have to deal with work and other kinds of like stress in life means that it's not probably a day-to-day structured curriculum, even though there is inherent structure. School is way more structured with assignments of teachers, a teacher that gets paid full time to do the job, which means that there's way more structure inherent in a public school system, which means they're able to get a better education. But the third argument here is that even though that public schools get funded way more than homeschools do, so they have way more resources. We say that there's like a lot more opportunities to take advanced physics or chemistry or even like trigonometry or like differential equations at a school where sometimes your parents can't teach you that because they don't have the knowledge to do so. And we say here that at those at the bottom, the most marginalized, those who choose to remain, for example, let's say because of religious reasons, they want to remain homeschooled, and then we're not talking about the rich people, the poor kids, they don't have access to tutors that can teach them differential calculus. And so as a result, we see here that there's a large educational disparity. Don't let them just like drop this like statistic and get away without warrantation. Prefer these three reasons as to why homeschoolers are uniquely worse than public schoolers. Then, on the Germany versus the US, you can extend through that the Germany example is a way better model of education. They say this is because Germany funds the education a lot more, but in essence, it's a lot simpler than that. In essence, Germany has a system where they want every single student, and like if you don't want to buy it to like the simple root cause, it's one of the causes is because every single student is involved, which means that there's more donations happening from the kids involved and the parents involved, which means the public education system is funded more. This is our donation point, which they kind of don't really respond to. Okay. I think that's everything on the contention one. Oh, sorry. One more thing on the disabled kids. Actually, this is just not true at all. Kids with disabilities are very, very allowed to, in Germany, to get homeschooled because this is a condition that prevents them from learning. This is a condition under, for example, if you prove, and the definition of this round, underside negative, if you prove you cannot adequately learn, as in Germany, you can remain at home and be homeschooled. In Germany, disabled kids who can very, very well be homeschooled, we say this is just a mischaracterization coming out of side affirmation. We also say that overall, like sicknesses, illnesses, mental illnesses even count. So if you just prove like a significant amount of just if you prove an inability to learn, you can be homeschooled, which kind of wipes out all of the side affirmations offense.
Touch the bullying point.
Yeah, and then also on the bullying point, a massive, massive turn here. School is meant to prepare you for the real world. Two reasons here. First here, even if you're homeschooled and sheltered from the world for 17 years of your life and you go to college, you will experience a reality shock. In fact, this is probably way worse than being in the middle school and high schoolers, yeah.
Do you think it's easier to deal with other kids being mean to you as an adult who has your own self-confidence or as a middle schooler going through puberty trying to find your identity?
That's the problem. You don't build your self-confidence because you never get exposed to it. We say here that if you're locked away in a basement for 17 years, maybe you have minimal engagement with other religious kids, but you don't experience the life of public school, especially when you go to college where professors don't really care about you, when you don't have you have such large class sizes, there's no one there to stand up for you. When you have a limited high school environment, a small environment where you have teachers and you have administrators and you have counselors, that teaches you better for the real world and allows you to prepare for a situation where you're dealing with other kids that may not like you, may not share the same religious beliefs as you, and maybe in opposition to you, but you learn how to deal with them. You don't get that on side affirmations at the house. So massive turn on the bullying here. We say here there's probably these on impacts. We say that generally better mental health is better for your lifespan and quality of life, which means you can just turn the contention one and vote for side negative. Then on contention two, good for society, we say here that we also solve. There's literally no unique reason to do the affirmative if for the most part these private school kids are these rich kids are inevitably going to private school kids. They're still taking their money out, which is the way they're saving $51 billion. But also we say that not 100% of the homeschool kids are extraordinarily rich. We say probably it's a majority, but there's some minority that's not exactly rich. that means those people are still going to school, still going to public school, which means we get access to those like marginal cost saving, but we outweigh that in the fact that they're able to get access to a public school education system, which means they're donating more to the system, and therefore we're able to turn their cost argument. And then on their ideology, this is kind of all addressing the disadvantages. We think this is a bad thing because when you let families run loose with their ideologies, they turn very quickly to extremism, radicalism, and that gets unchecked way more of the time. And yeah, that's kind of their entire BAF case. All right. Then, on disadvantage 1 about indoctrination and abuse, I'm going to read a couple more statistics that kind of solidify our case. First, abuse is systemically underreported. Homeschooled kids are 5 times less likely to be reported for abuse, but 3 times more likely to suffer from abuse. What does this mean? Well, abuse is systemically underreported, but then also they're more likely to suffer high magnitude impacts from that same abuse. This is from Reuters. We say here also, the second argument here is that most US states have no home visit requirements, and 11 states in the US don't even have mandated test scores. So even if they try to prove that, like, for example, you need to enforce a test, 11 states in the US don't even require you to mandate test scores, which means there is really a sloppy enforcement mechanism insofar as you can see with homeschoolers and entire Western education, people are able to bypass the system in like homeschoolers way more under their world because they like, kind of encourage that presumptively.
Extend how I talked about how there's no mechanism for it to
Oh yeah,
enforce these tests.
there's no mechanism to enforce these tests. Also, we say here that a lot of tests avoid religious conversation. They avoid and they just stick to the basic facts. For example, a lot of them don't talk about, for example, like they try to avoid controversial topics like, you know, like who, like a lot of the times, like they try to stray away from like the topics of like religion, which means that parents can get away with teaching them like extremely religious, radical ideologies, and then that's not reflected in the test scores because it'd be like, what's 2 plus 2? You don't learn that they're like white supremacists or like the KKK exists because oftentimes this shifts it away in the test scores. Okay, yeah, and then they say like it's non-unique because the parents will abuse them anyways. This is just non-responsive. To the point in which kids are going to school every single day and they're meeting with teachers, there's a way higher probability they're able to disclose that. A lot of kids like develop relationships, close relationships with teachers and able to share their situations at home, which means that on their side of the bench, they're never able to disclose it, whereas on our side of the house, you have some high probability of them disclosing it, which solves a lot of their abuse arguments. See, Germany's abuse arguments are, Germany's abuse is way better than that of the United States, simply because they're able to interact with the teacher. Look to the foreign ministry of Germany that literally said this quote. Then on the turn, they say when you persecute them, they're more likely to get extreme and way more anti-government. We say here that like most people who like are like very anti-government and already extreme are already doing this. It's already non-unique. The turn doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's very marginal. I don't like think this is a huge point in the round. But also we say here that even extend that once it's isolated in development, the development damage is too big. On our DA2 inequality, you can just extend all the responses to how private school is washed out. And the main important part here you're going to vote on is indoctrination and abuse, because ultimately there's no check back when you go to homeschooling. Whereas if you go to private school, there's still the social aspect. You still interact with other kids, which means you still maybe get bullied, but you learn from that. And also, there's some small majority of kids that go to public school, which means you fund them better, and there's more access to education. For those reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
Alright. You guys just need a second, or I'll be ready?
Can you give me like 5?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, ready?
Alright. My time begins. Oh, just framing new sheet. Yeah, okay. Time begins in 3, 2, 1. To the point at which side government has no offense at the end of this debate round, I'm still so proud to oppose. The way mechanism in this debate round is what's net benefits. You have to look at 3 factors. First, what's best for the student, what is best for the school system, and what's overall best for society. We can start with the student. We tell you that this abuse argument is just going to win through every single time, and it's probably the highest impact in this debate round. Why is this? We tell you that the only response to this is test solve, but Shauna gives you a very clear response, which is tests are not evaluating how you feel about, you know, your religious preferences or how you have a worldview. What these tests are doing is looking at like, can you do math? Can you do basic algebra? And what we tell you is like that is not responsive to the general abuse or to the general abuse argument. And he tells you that it's like not exclusive, that you can like be abused and then also not pass these test scores. And then the only thing that they say on this other point is this idea that like, oh, actually people are just going to be more anti-government. But if you hold these extremist views and indoctrinate your kids with them, you probably already so, as Shonik points out. So like this point is like pretty it's not a turn at all, and it definitely is probably not an argument. And then on the point that they mitigate and say child abuse is small, Shonik gives you the statistic that actually it's like extremely underreported and warrants out to you how that's the case. This is a very clear voter. Why is it the biggest in the debate round? Because we tell you that when you actually allow homeschooling to happen, it proliferates. That's on case, and it goes cold conceded. This means that every single time if kids go home and they're more likely to be abused, then that rate of abuse goes up, and that means that the dehumanization impacts we get access to always happen. You could just cleanly vote here. But even if you were like, no, for some reason I don't feel like it, then there's two other places you can look to. The next place is on the education system. They say that people are just going to go to the private schools instead. Honestly, like it doesn't really matter, but it still actually leads to a better educational outcomes. Why is that? We tell you that that response bites into their own response warrant, because now it's not like the government's paying any more if these kids are just going to private schools. But we then tell you this is actually probably still a good thing because you get valuable social interaction. This year, probably getting it in like church groups, but Shonik says that's not actually enough. Like we tell you that the development in the school is important. They then talk about this bullying point, but again, I responded to this and went cold conceded. This idea that it's actually getting it in schooling is the best situation because your teachers and administrators can protect you and they have the ability to stop it. Once you're out in the real world, there is no way to check back against it. The only way you build the self-confidence is in the bubble that is school. Then that's also another clear voter. The impact of that is mental health, right? The reason why is because your mental health goes down significantly if you are facing bullying later in life and you have no way to stop it. The third and final thing you can look at is...
It takes 20 years off their life.
Oh yeah, it takes 20 years off your life. This taps into our mental health and dehumanization impacts. Then the third thing you look at is society at large. We tell you you're going to have better outcomes if there are less people that are radicalized and indoctrinated and abused. This leads to a better society at large if people are going through this education system more so. Even if it costs even if we do buy that like it costs marginally more for the government because more people are going to be in it, buy that it's actually a good thing because it means that there's going to be increased voices and more important increased capital that demand for the government to fix the public school system. So overall you're going to see a better school system which leads to a better society at large, promotes human progress, increases the quality of life for every single person as when children grow up they get access to it. Now what are they going to try to go for? Honestly, I'm not quite sure, but if they had to pick something, I bet it would probably be along the lines of like the US isn't Germany, therefore like they're not actually comparable. What we tell you on the net is that like the United States and Germany, their educational ranks are so vast, but they still do have competition, right? In Germany, there are private and public schools. In the United States, homeschooling is not the direct competition of public schools, it's private schools. So by that, like, there is competition, there is actually these factors. The other thing, like, on Loki, like, they're gonna go for this factor, like, ideological, like, you're not being indoctrinated, literally crossplay everything Shonik tells you about these instances of how that's the case, and by that, like, well, actually, there's no way to check back against it, because the idea that, like, these tests aren't accurately accounting for, like, your worldview, and even if you buy they are, there's no enforcement mechanism for these tests that they provide to you, so you don't even know whether they'll be good ones or not. Then you can look at this at the bottom and just see that there's clear negative advantage or negative impacts here. For that reason, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Great.
Is anyone not ready?
Sure.
Okay, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Or, sorry, do you want an off-time roadmap?
Up to you.
Okay. I can do it then. I'll just be going over some voting issues. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so where are you going to vote in this debate? We think that there are a couple of clear voters for us. First, on education. So students do better when homeschooled because kids will only learn when they are actually paying attention and we actually engage them. It's much more engaging to listen to like a parent who's teaching you something or to like go to a museum when you're actually interested than going to a school where you're surrounded by like tons of kids. You could be like at a slower pace, but regardless, when you're surrounded by like an immense number of kids and not really getting this special like focus from the teacher. There are tons of resources like online courses for advanced math and science that you get like when you're homeschooling. Okay. Secondly, on like disabled kids and like special circumstances, fine, they can have disabilities, but you can still vote pretty cleanly on racial minorities. Thirdly, on bullying. So even if overcoming bullying makes you strong in the long term, thousands of kids commit suicide every single year due to bullying. If the youth mental health crisis is incredibly severe across the globe. Lives are the most important thing under utilitarianism, under net benefits. You can vote right here. Also, it isn't just true that getting bullied in middle school makes you stronger. They kind of just like posit this without any backing. Okay, on abuse, I think that this is pretty small scale. Most kids, even those in schools, do not report their abuse. Even if you buy this, you can wash it out with like the bullying, the suicide rate caused by bullying. On the question of indoctrination, I think our other arguments about how you learn more, tailored to your needs, and get better education results, and get better like educational results wash this out. You aren't voting here. Also, again, you can still be radicalized outside of school. Like you can still like, if you're getting like all these things that they say, like this can still happen after school. It's pretty small scope, but like if you are like getting some insane like Christian radicalization during homeschooling, you can obviously get that when you come home from school right after.
Stop time.
Yeah.
So I got in the MG this idea that abuse can still happen after school, but the specific argument that indoctrination also can happen outside of school, I never really saw it at MG.
I'm pretty sure it's there when I say that. I think it's there when I talk about how like there's still going to be like, if your family still believes in you're still going to be able to teach you the same values outside of school. But judge's discretion, it's not that important.
Okay, my time will continue in 3, 2, 1. Or sorry, 3, 2, 1. Okay, also on this idea of like radicalization, they say that like people become incredibly radical in their basement, but they don't interact with the analysis that Asha gives us about how radicalization is always way greater on their side of the house. Look at her link chain about like how, like for example, someone could teach Christian ideals, then that parent could like would be forced to have their children go to public schools, and consequently it would engender a hatred for the government, which always creates a more radical person. It always those parents then tell their children like, oh, like the government hates us, they hate our Christian ideals, and then they proceed to teach their children more. And
It's like not that bad to not believe in evolution. It's really bad to like try and kill the present.
yeah, what Asha just said.
You
It's
have to
really
say it.
it's really bad to it's not like that bad to not believe in evolution. It's much worse to like think like the government wants us dead and then like consequently do like radical beliefs about the government. So what are like all of these things are kind of washing out, but like what are you voting on extremely clearly? On enjoyment. The framework for this round is net benefits, and this literally makes people happier. Look at what Asha said in her speech about how people have the ability to go to museums, have the ability to like see art, have the ability to enjoy stuff. Why? Because they don't have the structured academic day that comes with public school. They're able to like experience, as Asha says in her speech, homeschooling is just way more fun. This is just completely conceded. Judge, look to your flow. A dropped argument is conceded, making it the cleanest place to vote in this round. Also, it's the biggest scale. All homeschooled kids every single day. This translates to a lifelong love of learning. Every single day, homeschool students get to experience stuff that they are actually passionate about. They get to go out, they get to go to museums, they get to like have fun after like during school. They can like go to a soccer game. They don't need to have like some rigid school structure of going to math, science, English. They can do stuff that they're actually interested in. They can research philosophy. They literally have a blank slate to do whatever they want and not like this extremely rigid cycle. Asha tells you this in her speech, and this is by far the easiest government ballot. Thank you.
Great round, guys.
Good round.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, judges.
Let's double check for a
Thank you.
second. Thank you.
one. I mean, it's fine because it's not blind. It was a 2 for Bob.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm gonna let them know, but I don't want my RFD to be recorded, so I'm gonna tell them to turn off the recording. Yeah. If you don't mind yours being recorded, okay.
My partner's in the bathroom, so
Okay. We can wait.
sorry.
Can we ask that our RFD isn't recorded?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.